Julia covered a stranger's $2 coffee without thinking twice. She forgot about it the next day. But Harold never did. Months later, a lawyer walked through the diner doors with her name on an envelope, and nothing would ever be the same. Sometimes the smallest acts create the biggest ripples. The fluorescent lights hummed their usual tired song at 4 a.m. Julia wiped down the counter for the third time that hour, her reflection in the chrome coffee machine showing dark circles she'd stopped trying to hide. The truck stop diner sat at the edge of nowhere, Kansas, where Highway 70 cut through endless plains, and the only customers were long-haul drivers and insomniacs with nowhere better to be. She'd been on her feet for 9 hours. Her anatomy textbook sat wedged between the napkin dispenser and the register, sticky notes marking chapters on the cardiovascular system. Between orders, she'd managed to read maybe 6 pages. At this rate, her nursing degree would take another 3 years. The bell above the door chimed. Cold air rushed in, carrying the bite of January with it. An elderly man shuffled through, his movements careful and deliberate. He wore a threadbare military jacket, the Marine Corps emblem faded but still visible on the sleeve. His hands trembled as he approached the counter, fishing through his coat pockets with the concentration of someone counting every cent. Just a small coffee, please," he said, his voice rough but polite. Quarters and dimes clinked onto the counter. He counted them twice, his shaking fingers making the coins slide. Julia glanced at the pile. $1.63. The small coffee was $1.95. The man's face flushed. He started recounting, his hands trembling harder now. Whether from cold or shame, she couldn't tell. A nickel slipped off the counter and rolled toward the floor. He bent to retrieve it, and Julia heard his knee crack, saw him wince. "Small coffee coming up," she said, sweeping the coins back toward him in one smooth motion. She grabbed a medium cup instead, filled it to the brim, and set it in front of him. "On the house tonight, refills are free." He looked up at her, confused. "I can't." "You can?" Julia said, sliding the coins into his palm and closing his fingers around them. "It's slow tonight. Coffee's just going to sit here and get stale anyway." Something shifted in his expression. His eyes, watery and pale blue, held hers for a moment. He nodded once, a gesture that seemed to carry more weight than simple gratitude. "Thank you, miss." He took the corner booth, the one with duct tape holding the vinyl together, and wrapped both hands around the cup. Julia watched him from the corner of her eye as she restocked the pie case. He didn't drink right away, just held the warmth, letting it seep into his fingers. That became the pattern. 3 times a week, sometimes 4, Harold would come in during her shift. Always the same order, always that corner booth. He'd nurse 1 cup for an hour, sometimes 2, staring out at the dark parking lot or reading a battered paperback western. Julia learned his name from the signature on a check he used once when he had enough in his account. Harold Milner. Their conversations were brief. He'd mention the cold. She'd refill his cup without asking. Once, he told her about Eleanor, his wife, who used to make coffee so strong it could strip paint. His voice softened when he said her name. Another time, he noticed Julia's textbook and asked if she was in school. When she explained the nursing program, he smiled. A real smile that transformed his weathered face. "Eleanor was a nurse," he said. "Best person I ever knew." He showed her a creased photo from his wallet. A woman with kind eyes and dark hair, wearing scrubs, standing in front of a hospital. The photo was decades old. The colors faded to blues and yellows. Julia noticed things. The way Harold's coat had a broken zipper he'd safety pinned shut. How he always ordered just coffee, never food, even when she could hear his stomach growl. The way he studied the bulletin board near the register, covered in photos of truckers' families, graduations, weddings, new babies, as if searching for something he'd lost. One morning in late February, Harold didn't come in. Julia figured he'd caught the flu going around. But then a week passed. 2 weeks. His corner booth sat empty, and Julia found herself glancing at the door during what had been his usual time, expecting to see that careful shuffle, that faded Marine jacket. She asked Tom, the day manager, if he'd seen the old veteran. Tom shrugged. "People move on." He probably found a place closer to wherever he lives. Julia nodded, but something felt off. She thought about checking hospitals, but she didn't even know Harold's address. Hell, she barely knew him at all. Just a regular who liked his coffee hot and his booth quiet. The night shift continued its relentless rhythm. New regulars filled the corner booth. Julia's textbook gained more sticky notes. The coffee machine hummed. The highway stretched on. And Julia never imagined that a $2 gesture she'd already forgotten would be the thing Harold Milner remembered most. March came in with unseasonable warmth, melting the last gray piles of snow in the diner parking lot. Julia had picked up an afternoon shift to cover for Sandra, who'd thrown her back out lifting a crate of potatoes. The lunch rush had cleared, leaving behind a scatter of truckers nursing bottomless coffee and killing time before their next haul. Julia was refilling ketchup bottles when the bell chimed. She glanced up out of habit and froze mid-squeeze. The man who entered didn't belong. Pressed navy suit, leather briefcase, shoes too polished for a place where most customers wore steel-toed boots caked in road salt. He surveyed the diner with the analytical gaze of someone assessing property value, then approached the counter. "I'm looking for Julia Hendricks," he said. Her stomach dropped. Official-looking men asking for you by name never meant anything good. Unpaid parking tickets? Student loan collections? Her mind raced through possibilities, none of them pleasant. "That's me," she said, setting down the ketchup bottle and wiping her hands on her apron. "My name is Robert Chin. I'm an attorney with Morrison and Associates." He extended a business card. "Is there somewhere we could speak privately?" Tom looked up from the grill, concern creasing his forehead. Julia's hands had gone cold. "The back booth is empty." She followed Chun to the far corner. Not Harold's booth, but close, and slid onto the cracked vinyl. Chun set his briefcase on the table with a decisive click, extracting a manila folder thick with documents. "Ms. Hendricks, I'm here regarding the estate of Harold James Milner. I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. Milner passed away on February 26th. The words hit her like a physical blow. Harold. She'd known something was wrong, had felt it in her gut, but hearing it confirmed made it real in a way that hollowed her out. "How?" The word came out barely above a whisper. "Peacefully in his sleep. Heart failure. The landlord found him 3 days later." Chen's voice softened slightly. He was 78 years old. Julia's vision blurred. She'd served him coffee 100 times and never once asked if he had family, if anyone checked on him, if he was okay going home to an empty apartment. 3 days. He'd been alone for 3 days. "I'm telling you this," Chun continued, "because you've been named as a beneficiary in his will." Julia's head snapped up. "What? There must be a mistake. I barely knew him. He was just a regular." Mr. Milner was quite specific. Chun opened the folder, revealing documents covered in legal text. He had no surviving children. His daughter, Mary, died in 1982 at age 7 from leukemia. His wife, Eleanor, passed in 2019. No siblings, no extended family. He updated his will in January of this year with explicit instructions regarding you. Chun slid a document across the table. Julia stared at her own name typed in official font, as if seeing it there made her part of some story she didn't understand. "The estate is modest," Chen explained, "but it includes the following: 1987 Ford F-150 pickup truck, currently parked at his former residence, pink slip and keys." He placed them on the table, actual keys worn and real. Additionally, a cashier's check in the amount of $18,400. Julia stopped breathing. $18,000. That was a year of school. Books, lab fees, rent. It was time, actual time, to finish what she'd started instead of bleeding herself dry one night shift at a time. And this. Chun withdrew a leather journal, its cover worn smooth with handling. Julia's name was written on the first page in shaky cursive. "Mr. Milner left specific instructions that you receive his personal journals. There are 4 volumes total. The others are in the truck. This one he requested be delivered directly." Julia reached for it with trembling hands. The leather was warm, as if Harold had just been holding it. She opened to a random page and saw dates from last November, saw her own name in his handwriting. Julia refilled my coffee 3 times today without my asking. Eleanor used to do that, know what I needed before I said it. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. The diner dissolved into a blur. Julia pressed her palm against her mouth, but the sob came anyway, raw and sudden. Tom appeared with a glass of water, exchanging a worried glance with Chun. Truckers at the counter studiously looked away, giving her privacy in the only way the space allowed. I don't understand, Julia managed. Why me? I just gave him free coffee. Chen's expression softened into something almost paternal. In his final arrangements, Mr. Milner wrote that you showed him kindness without expectation of return. He said that in a life marked by loss, you reminded him that strangers could still choose compassion. He wanted to give you what no one gave his Eleanor, a chance to finish becoming who you're meant to be. Julia clutched the journal to her chest. Outside, the afternoon sun painted the parking lot gold. 18-wheelers hummed in their spots. The highway stretched toward horizons she'd only dreamed of reaching. Harold had been counting coins for coffee while sitting on $18,000, because what mattered to him wasn't the money. It was the warmth, the smile, the moment someone treated him like he still mattered. And now he'd given her wings fashioned from his own quiet departure. A final act of generosity from a man who'd spent his last months alone except for stolen hours in a corner booth. When can I get the truck? Julia asked, her voice steadier now. Chen almost smiled. Whenever you're ready. Julia called in sick for the first time in 2 years. She sat on her apartment floor at 2 a.m., Harold's journal open in her lap, unable to stop reading even as her eyes burned with exhaustion and tears. The entries began in 1968. Harold's handwriting from 50 years ago was steady, confident, nothing like the trembling script from recent months. Danang, 107 degrees. Reynolds got hit today, 19 years old. He was showing me pictures of his girl back home an hour before. Eleanor's letters are the only thing keeping me sane. She writes about normal things, her nursing classes, her mother's garden, a stray cat that adopted their porch. I read them until the paper falls apart. Julia traced her finger over the words. Her father had been in Vietnam too. Different years, different battalion, but the same war. Daniel Hendricks. She'd been 3 when the officers came to the door, too young to remember his face except from photographs. Her mother never talked about it, the grief too thick to push through, and she died when Julia was 16. Heart attack. The doctor said it was sudden, but Julia always wondered if grief could kill you slowly, one silent year at a time. She'd grown up with a folded flag in a triangle case and no stories. No context for the man who'd left one morning and became a name on a wall in D.C. Herald's entries filled in shadows she didn't know existed. He wrote about the weight of the rifle, the sound mortars made, the way you never forgot your first firefight. But he also wrote about the absurd. Stealing mangoes from a local orchard, a monkey that infiltrated their camp and stole MREs, the lieutenant who could quote entire Shakespeare plays from memory during watch shifts. We're not heroes, he wrote in July 1969. We're just scared kids trying to make it home. But we take care of each other. That matters. When everything else is chaos, that matters. Julia flipped forward, watching Harold's life unspool across pages. His return home in 1970. The struggle to sleep without hypervigilance. Eleanor, always Eleanor, patient and steady, helping him find solid ground again. Their wedding in 1971, described in such tender detail that Julia's throat ached. The jobs Harold cycled through, factory work, construction, finally settling as a postal carrier. The joy when Eleanor got pregnant, the devastation when Mary was born premature, the exhausting years of hospitals and treatments. Mary made it to 7, Harold wrote in an entry from 1982. The ink smudged as if tears had fallen while he wrote. 7 years of her laugh, her questions, the way she collected rocks and named each one. The leukemia took her in spring, when everything else was blooming. Eleanor held her at the end. Couldn't. I failed them both. The entries grew sparse after that. Years passed between some. Harold threw himself into work, into routine, into surviving rather than living. Eleanor kept them afloat with her nursing shifts and her stubborn refusal to let grief consume everything. They traveled small trips, nothing fancy. The Grand Canyon, Mount Rushmore, coastal Maine. They built a quiet life from the wreckage of their dreams. Then 2019. Eleanor's decline happened fast. A cancer diagnosis in March, gone by July. Harold's entries from that period were fragments, barely coherent. She was my compass. Without her, I don't know which direction is forward. Julia discovered that Harold had been a regular at 3 different diners over the past 5 years, always ordering just coffee, always sitting alone. One closed down. Another banned him after he fell asleep in a booth and the night manager thought he'd died. The truck stop was his 3rd attempt at finding somewhere warm that would tolerate his presence. The recent entries mentioned Julia by name. The young waitress, Julia, covered my tab again tonight. She studies medical books between orders. Reminds me of Eleanor at that age, determined to help people even when the world makes it hard. She has kind eyes, tired but kind. Another entry, dated January 15th, updated my will today. Chun thinks I'm crazy, leaving everything to a girl I barely know. But who else is there? The money's just sitting in the bank, and when I'm gone, the state will take it. Better it goes to someone who'll use it to build something good. Eleanor would approve. She always said the best investment is in people who still believe they can make a difference. Julia pressed the journal to her forehead, shoulders shaking. Harold had seen something in her that she'd barely seen in herself. Potential worthiness. A future worth investing in. He'd taken his loneliness, his loss, his modest savings, and transformed them into a bridge for someone else to cross. The morning light crept through her window. Julia stood, joints stiff from sitting too long, and pulled a cardboard box from her closet. Inside was everything she had of her father. The folded flag, his dog tags, 3 photographs, and a purple heart in a velvet case. No letters, no journal, just objects without context. She placed Harold's journal beside her father's medals. 2 Marines, 2 wars, 2 men who'd carried weight she'd never fully understand. But Harold had given her a gift her father never could: words, stories, a map of what that life had been, proof that the men who served were more than their service, more than their trauma, more than the silence that followed them home. Julia picked up her phone and searched for veteran centers in Kansas City. There was one 40 minutes away, always looking for volunteers. Reading companions for older vets, they called it. Someone to sit and listen, to bear witness, to help them know their stories still mattered. She could do that. Harold had shown her how. The truck coughed to life on the 3rd try, belching blue smoke that made the apartment complex parking lot smell like burning oil. Julia patted the dashboard like she'd seen people do in movies, whispering, "Come on, Harold, let's go." The F-150 was a beast, manual transmission, no power steering, a radio that only picked up AM stations. But it ran, and it cut her commute from 90 minutes on 2 buses to 30 minutes of highway driving. She named it Eleanor because Harold would have liked that. By April, Julia had rearranged her entire life. She dropped to 2 shifts a week at the diner, just enough to keep health insurance, and enrolled full-time in the nursing program at Johnson County Community College. The cashier's check sat in a new savings account, carefully budgeted tuition, books, rent, groceries. If she was careful, it would last 18 months. Long enough to finish her RN and start working in a field that paid more than minimum wage plus tips. The other 3 journals lived in Eleanor's glove compartment. Julia read them in parking lots between classes, during lunch breaks, late at night when sleep wouldn't come. She learned that Harold had loved westerns and baseball, that he'd been afraid of dogs after one attacked him as a child, that he proposed to Eleanor at a bus stop in the rain because he couldn't wait for a more romantic moment. She learned that her father's war and Harold's war were the same in all the ways that mattered: the fear, the camaraderie, the impossible task of returning to a world that hadn't changed while you had. On a Saturday in May, Julia drove Eleanor to the Kansas City Veterans Resource Center. The building was modest, tucked between a laundromat and a tax preparation office. Inside, folding tables held coffee and donuts. A bulletin board advertised support groups, job training, housing assistance. Older men sat in clusters, some in veteran ball caps, others in worn jeans and flannel shirts that had seen better decades. A woman named Patricia, maybe 60, with close-cropped gray hair and a Marine Corps tattoo on her forearm, approached Julia at the volunteer sign-in desk. First time, Julia nodded. I'm here for the Reading Companion program. Patricia's eyes softened. We can always use more. Fair warning. Some of these guys don't talk much. Others won't stop. You just gotta meet them where they are. They paired Julia with a man named Eugene, 82, who'd served in Korea. He sat in a wheelchair by the window, a paperback Western face down on his lap. His hands were gnarled with arthritis, the pages too difficult to turn alone. Eugene, this is Julia. She's gonna read with you today. Eugene squinted at her. You know anything about Korea? No, sir, Julia said, pulling up a chair. But I'd like to learn if you want to tell me. Something shifted in his expression. He didn't smile exactly, but the hardness around his eyes eased. Chapter 3, he said, tapping the book. The sheriff just found the cattle rustlers. Julia read for an hour. Eugene corrected her pronunciation of character names and offered commentary on historically inaccurate gun descriptions. When she finished the chapter, he told her about the Korean winter, how cold could hurt worse than bullets, how he'd lost 2 toes to frostbite and sometimes still felt them ache when storms rolled in. She came back the next Saturday. And the next. Eugene introduced her to Ray, who'd been in Desert Storm. Ray introduced her to Paul, Vietnam, who'd known a Daniel Hendricks from Nebraska, different battalion, but they'd crossed paths at a firebase near Hugh. Paul didn't remember much, but he remembered the name, and somehow that mattered more than Julia expected. She told them about Harold, about the coffee, the inheritance, the journals. Paul nodded slowly. He gave you what he needed someone to give him. That's how it works. We take care of each other, or we don't make it. By September, Julia was halfway through her program, maintaining a 3.8 GPA and working clinical rotations at a county hospital. She traded her diner uniform for scrubs, her coffee-stained apron for a stethoscope that still felt foreign around her neck. The first time she inserted an 4 successfully, she thought of Eleanor. When she held a dying patient's hand, she thought of Harold, alone in his apartment for 3 days. When she advocated for a homeless veteran in the ER who was being dismissed by an attending physician, she thought of all the men at the resource center who'd taught her that service didn't end when the uniform came off. December brought her pinning ceremony. The nursing school auditorium filled with families, parents, siblings, children holding congratulations signs. Julia sat in the staging area, adjusting her cap, watching classmates embrace their people. She'd printed a photo of Harold from his Marine days, young, serious, the whole future ahead of him. She'd found it tucked in the back of Journal 3, next to a letter from Eleanor that he'd kept for 50 years. She placed the photo on the empty seat beside her mother's memory, beside the father she'd never known, beside everyone who'd carried her here without realizing it. When they called her name, Julia walked across that stage knowing that every step was built on $2 and a small coffee, on kindness without audience, on the radical act of seeing someone's humanity when the world had decided they were invisible. The seed Harold planted in that corner booth had rooted deep, branching in directions he'd never lived to see. But Julia saw. She carried his story and her father's silence and Eleanor's dedication forward into exam rooms and hospital corridors, into moments where a small gesture might mean everything to someone counting their last coins. After the ceremony, Julia drove Eleanor to Harold's grave, a simple marker in a veteran's cemetery, surrounded by thousands of others who'd served and returned and eventually gone quiet. She placed her nursing pin on the headstone, just for a moment, and whispered, "Thank you." The wind carried her words across rows of white stones, each one a story, each one proof that we're all connected by invisible threads of compassion that outlast us. Julia retrieved her pin, tucked Harold's photo back in her wallet, and drove toward the life he'd made possible, one small kindness blooming into a forest of tomorrows. Harold saw something in Julia that she hadn't yet seen in herself. A $2 coffee became a bridge between 2 lives, 2 wars, 2 generations. Kindness doesn't need an audience, it just needs to be real. What small act have you done that might mean more than you know? Share your story in the comments. And if this one touched you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that every gesture matters. Subscribe to embrace the journey for more stories that prove humanity is still worth believing in. See you in the next video.